Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So I really hope you guys are all good. Just want to say a huge thank you to you all, everyone who's been watching, all the new subscribers, welcome, hi. So obviously I post my videos once a month. Used to be once a week, but with other work coming in as well, it just kind of got a little bit difficult trying to keep on top of everything. So I've had to cut down on this, unfortunately, but I will always be here for you guys. So before we get started on today's case, if you guys can do me a favour, just give me a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. I will never ask you guys for money, but a subscription is always free. And let's dive in to today's case. So, today's case, I have chosen to talk about a very little known cult that formed in Australia in the 1980s. And despite the fact that they are very not much known, they have featured in various news stories over the years. Even as far as over here in the UK, they got featured. A couple of incidents in America and other countries around the world, India and whatnot. And they were also linked, this particular cult was linked to an incident in Kenya. And this happened to be the third biggest cult suicide murder um, incident in the world. So obviously everyone knows about Jim Jones and Jonestown. A lot of people know about Heaven's Gate. But this one was labelled as the third biggest, and it resulted in the deaths of 429 people. So, with all that said and done, we're going to dive into Australia's very little known, the Jesus Christians, also known as the Kidney Cult. So, the Christians, they were a group formed in Melbourne in 1981 by a married couple called Dave and Sherry Mckay. Now, Dave had already been sort of involved in another cult. They were called the Children of God, but he later left further down the line as he disagreed with some of their practices. In particular, he disagreed with something that they involved in called flirty fishing. Now, flirty fishing is where you have a particular member who is societally attractive. They would go out to bars and whatnot, talk to someone of their opposite gender, use their flirtatious ways, and draw in that person to join in the cult. Dave didn't like this, so he ends up leaving the Children of God. And the group that Dave and Sherry decide to make, they go through several name changes before they settle on the Jesus Christians. Now, and this wasn't until 1996 that they officially started calling themselves the Jesus Christians. Now, the biggest belief of the Jesus Christians is that you can't serve God and money at the same time. Now, what I mean by that is, so Dave and Sherry and their family, so they went on to have a daughter. They adopted a few children as well. And their daughter lives with them in a compound somewhere in Australia. Get onto that a little bit later. But within this compound are other members of the cult, and they literally don't spend money on anything. So a couple of years back, I think it may have been last year, Channel 7 News in Australia, they were invited to live with the cult. And when they were having a tour of the house, Dave's daughter and Cherry's daughter, they had her living in a tent with a queen-size mattress in what should have been the living room of this house. Now, other members of the group they will go out and they will scour around supermarket bins, and they will pick up any discarded food. So obviously supermarkets have a huge amount of waste. Everything's all still pre-packed, but the group will go through all these bins, take everything that's not been touched, and then take it home. And that's how the Jesus Christians live. They call it freeganism, and everything they do, they go out and do some charitable work and things like that, but they don't want any recognition for their charity work. Now, by 1983, the group began getting media attention. Some of the members, like I said, they went on to do some free work, and a lot of the members got followed around while they were doing this free work. In 1984, one member, Boyd Ellery, he was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment for setting fire to a banknote in Sydney. Now, this was to protest against trusting money and not trusting God. And this protest was broadcast on national TV. Now, only a few months later, in January of '85, the group were then seen gluing $2 notes to the pavement, and the notes were glued in a way to spell out certain messages. And these messages were protesting about greed and money. And this was all outside post offices in Victoria and South Wales. New South Wales, sorry, should I say. Now, in May and June of 1985, the 6 youngest members of the Jesus Christians, they ranged between 12 and 15 years old. They ended up walking 1,000 miles across Nullarbor Desert, and this was in with no support of anything. They didn't have any adult supervision, they had no water, no food, and this was just to push their test. And again, this is something I'm going to touch on in a little bit. Right, sorry about that, guys. Just had to pause there for a moment. So, the group of 12 to 15-year-olds, they walk and end up walking 1,000 miles across the Nullarbor Desert, and this is on the interior of Australia. And this is with no medical support whatsoever, no water, no food, no adult supervision. And this was something that the group usually did. Something that we're going to touch on in a little bit in regards of what I mentioned at the start of the video. In 1990, they travelled to America, and this is to hand out over 290,000 books. Now, these books were titled The Fall of America, and whilst trying to promote this book, they are wearing t-shirts, and the t-shirts depict the American flag hung upside down. And the caption on the t-shirt was, "Caption, Pride goeth before a fall." Now, what we do know about Americans is they are very, very patriotic people, take great pride in their flag. It's in fact illegal to hang the flag a certain way, or it's even illegal to have the flag touching the floor. I can't imagine them, the Jesus Christians, doing this kind of thing and actually getting any support in America wearing that kind of t-shirt. I really can't imagine it. In 1994, the group, including Cherry Mckay this time, then travelled to India to voluntarily clean sewers. And as they did this, they were protesting as well. So this was to protest against sanitation in India and the lack of cleaning supplies, or what they felt were the lack of cleaning supplies. Now, during one of these protests, the group ended up standing in a sewer for over a week, and this is to spread awareness of the poor sanitation. And this is where one member, Craig Hendry, he ended up contracting typhoid. In 1995, the Jesus Christians, they end up converting a section of the open sewer, and this was in a place called Chennai. And they converted the open sewer into a children's playground. The project was estimated to be worth around $950,000. Now, after a year, this was handed over to the Indian government. However, the government ended up demolishing this, and it's because it had not been built without any planning permission. Now, in April 97 and 98, several members of the group were arrested at the Royal Easter Show in Sydney. They went there to protest. They come dressed as giant babies in oversized nappies. They highlighted how Jesus said that his followers needed to be like children to later enter God's kingdom. The introduction of the books said that we are children of God, and this led. So while they were dressed as babies, they were trying to publish some more books, and the opening of this book, was "We are children of God." Now, this led to some confusion as who this group were, and a lot of people believed that they were the Children of God cult. Now, in the late 90s, followers of the group have relocated to the UK. And there are a couple of two very notable recruits while they were in the UK. This was one of them, a 19-year-old man called Kyrie Sheridan. He was from Guildford in Surrey, and he just one day disappears without a trace. Goes to join the Jesus Christians. And his mother, Bernie, she is so concerned. Naturally, she is so concerned. She ends up contacting the police. She tells them, my son's gone missing. His name's Kyrie. And later on down the line, Kyrie actually, through the grapevine, he must hear about this, and he ends up presenting himself at the police station, and he states that he's not missing, and he just basically tells them where he was. He tells them that he's joined a Christian group, and the police then tell Bernie that Kyrie is happy, and that when Bernie tried to stop her son from leaving, she got herself in such a hysteric state, she ended up having to be restrained by the police and handcuffed, and she was actually arrested. In June of 2000, two members, Susan and Roland Giustempi, they were distributing a book called The Liberator, and this was on Romford High Street, and they were approached by a 16-year-old boy called Bobby Kelly. Now, Bobby later goes home to tell his nan about the Christians they had met. He later goes back out, and he returns with an expression to join the Jesus Christians. Now, a few days later, some members of the group visited Bobby's nan. Bobby then leaves with them and cuts all contact with his nan. However, during this period, he's visiting his youth worker in St. Peter's Anglican Church in Harold Wood. Now, the worker, David Whitehouse, said that Bobby seemed really scared, which was really not like Bobby at all. With the help of a charity called Catalyst, so Catalyst are a charity that work to help people who have stepped out of cults or any cult-like behaviour. And this was also with the help of a solicitor named Claire Kirby, who specialised in legal action against cults. They worked on a rescue mission. This was then specified that Bobby was to be made a ward of cult. Bobby eventually, he was actually found living in the New Hampshire forest, and this was with a Christian member called Reinhard Zuna, sorry. And Bobby was taken away from Reinhard and the forest, and he was actually placed into foster care. No members of the group were charged with kidnap, But Susan and Roland, they were end up given 6 months imprisonment in contempt of court. But this was later suspended when Bobby spoke up to them. He sent the judge a note pleading their case, and he said that obviously they done nothing to him. He went with his own free will, blah blah blah, and the judge sort of took pity on them, and he gives them a suspended sentence. Now, this case was heavily publicised in the UK in a newspaper called the Daily Express in July 2000. And Bobby has spoken out over the years numerous times. He's actually done a podcast with both Susan and Roland. He's done other podcasts in regards to talking about the Jesus Christians. And he still, to this day, he maintains that nothing... I mean, he joined at his own free will. He left at his own free will. Susan and Roland actually later on down the line, they left the Jesus Christians themselves. Now, there were also a couple of big stories in Australia in regards of young people joining the cult. This was a 22-year-old woman called Alicia Spencer. She discovers the Jesus Christian YouTube channel, which we're going to touch on in a little bit. And she begins interacting with Jesus Christian members. And one of these was a member named Joseph. Now, later on down the line, when Alicia fully indoctrinates herself within the Jesus Christians, she and Joseph actually marry. And she then cuts off contact with her mother, Renee. Now, Renee, she fought hard to fight for her daughter's freedom. And Dave Mckay, on his YouTube channel, he actually openly speaks about this, and he talks some degrading, awful stuff about Renee. He mainly calls her a Lucifer, so a Satan worshipper. And obviously labels her as a devil worshipper. Anything to do with Satan and the devil and whatnot, using both words. He says that she's worshipping the devil and whatnot. Along with some other really derogatory terms. And Renee ends up using this as a catalyst to sue Dave in court, and the court settled in Renee's favour. She was awarded $85,000 in damages. Now, the news channel that I spoke about earlier, called Spotlight, this video is actually available on YouTube. If you guys want to look it up after this, then I really, really implore you to do so. So they end up doing a special show in which a reporter is sent to live with Dave and Sherry at their Melbourne compound, which I already spoke about earlier. And this reporter actually manages to reunite both Renee and Alicia. And naturally, because Dave Mckay is that type of leader who doesn't want to lose control, he wants to stay in control at any given moment, and he refuses Renee and Alicia to have any alone time. So the reuniting is held in a front room, and naturally Dave and Sherry have to be there as well, along with Alicia's husband Joseph. Up until that point, Alicia and Renee, they are only corresponding by email, and this is another thing that Dave really, really stresses. He doesn't like phone calls. Anyone can only contact either by email or no contact whatsoever. And Alicia, she's very, very cold towards her mother during this interview. She even goes as far as referring to Renee as Renee. She doesn't say my mum, she calls her Renee. When Renee gets a little bit upset, she hugs her daughter. Alicia just says, "Oh," like, sort of him, like really, really cold, really abrupt. A little further down the line, Dave, he realises that he's losing a bit of control during this interview. So he makes a suggestion that Renee and Alicia speak without the cameras, but on the condition that Joseph is watching them. And Renee agrees to this because she knows that this is the only option. She has no other options left, and this is the only contact that she's going to get with her daughter. She's going to take every single bit of that. Another young person who joined the group was a man called Christian Stevens, who was 18, and he, again, was from Australia. Now, Christian was a little bit different from Alicia. Christian had some learning difficulties. He had autism, and this made him a little bit more susceptible, shall I say, to someone like Dave Mckay. And he actually joins the Jesus Christians just 2 days after celebrating his 18th birthday. His parents are Jenny and Chris, and Christian was the sixth of their six sons. Christian had found the Jesus Christians YouTube page, and in particular the video that Dave had put up encouraging people to hate their parents. Chris said that on the day Christian walks out of the house with a backpack, and he just didn't say a single word. So Chris manages to jump in his car, he catches up to Christian, and Christian just basically says to him, "Oh, I'm off out, I'll be back whatever time." This time doesn't come, and Christian hasn't come home. And Jenny and Chris later find a note telling them that he was going to join the Jesus Christians. And he says to him not to look for me, but if you do want to contact, here's an email address. So Jenny and Chris hire a private detective, and 1 year to the day that he walks out, so not long after Christian's 19th birthday, the private eye tracks him down to living in a compound in Melbourne. So Jenny, she jumps on a plane, she flies all the way over to Melbourne, she finds the address that where he's staying at, and she walks up to Christian, and she immediately just flings herself around him, she gives him a hug. He's a bit more receptive to what I described the meeting between Renee and Alicia. He's hugging Jenny back, and he just basically says, "Oh, I'll be in touch soon." So Jenny pleads, she plans to meet Christian in a couple of days, and she then receives an email from Christian. An email from Dave Mckay stating that he also had to be at that meeting. Christian couldn't meet his own mother on his own. And Chris and Jenny, they decline this. And it was later found out down the line, so all contact stopped at this point, and it was later found out down the line that Dave and Sherry had sent Christian to live in a coal compound in Vancouver in Canada. Now, as to why the Jesus Christians are referred to as the kidney cult, which I mentioned earlier, so as of 2025, around 30 members of the cult, they have been told by Dave and Sherry that they need to donate one of their kidneys to someone who is less fortunate than them. Because obviously we can survive with only just one functioning kidney. And people, those 30 people, they have the scars to prove it. I've seen pictures of the scars. And like I said, I implore you to watch the Spotlight Channel 7 documentary that is on YouTube. This particular was highlighted in another documentary back in 2003. This was by a man called John Ronson. It was called Kidneys for Jesus, where John spends a year with Jesus Christians and Dave Mckay in particular. The Christians are travelling around the UK and the US donating their kidneys. This ends up making headlines in 2004 in Australia, where Dave reveals that the group had actually lied to health authorities to be able to donate the kidneys. In 2005, Roland and Susan, they were in Kenya. They end up being charged with adoption of a 27-year-old woman with her 7-year-old son. So they are charged, and after the father of this woman, he complains. All the charges are later dropped when the woman signs an affidavit against her father, saying that she joined with free will. Now, in October 2006, Dave and Cherry, they travelled to Long Beach in California. And this was to do with Reinhard, who I mentioned earlier. An incident happened where he was assaulted and it resulted in a fractured spine. Reinhard had a bleed on the brain, he had numerous cuts, left in a coma, and there were 4 people in particular that Dave and Cherry blamed for this incident. So they go over to California and they present a mock trial for these 4 people. But the 4 people, they don't show up to this. So people, other Christians in the group, they volunteer to be sentenced. The sentence that Dave and Cherry come up with is 25 whips of a cane. This was to be carried out on the volunteers in an attempt to illustrate their understanding of the cross of Christ. God hates the sin, but loves the sinner. In 2007, Dave and Cherry, this one was a bit of a surprise when I read this, they were actually invited as guests on the Jeremy Kyle show. So for those of you who don't know, particularly if you may be abroad or you may be a little bit too young to remember, the Jeremy Kyle show was a really popular talk show, quite trashy to be honest, and there's clips all over TikTok, all over YouTube of this show. I beg you to go watch them. But anyway, it was, people would go on and sometimes it was obvious it was a setup, but other times it was kind of sad to see. But it was a very popular thing that ran for very many years until an incident a few years back meant that the show was cancelled. Now, Dave and Cherry, like I said, they were invited on as guests on the 11th of December 2007, and this was a cult special. And Dave, he was actually compared live on TV to Jim Jones. And then Dave, he gets really angry because he's not in control of this interview. He gets really angry and he walks off the stage, and he returns a little while later saying, well, just let him do his thing. In February 2008, Roland and Susan, they later took part on Channel 4's Wife Swap UK, another really trashy popular programme that's kind of all over the internet at the moment. And this was around 2 years before they actually left the cult in August 2010. And they go on to form their own ministry called Making It Real. Now, in November of 2010, the Jesus Christians, they actually disband. But 6 years later, they come back and they launch a channel on YouTube called Time Survivors, and Dave actually launches his own channel called A Voice in the Desert. In March of 2021, Pablo Salem, the leader of the Liberamentes, which translates to Free Minds in Argentina. And Pablo in particular, he was an anti-cult organiser. He files a complaint against the Jesus Christians after two members had contacted a 30-year-old woman and a man in his 20s about joining them. And he particularly knew these two people. So Pablo then files a legal complaint accusing the group of human rights violations, said that their practices amounted to human trafficking and labour exploitation and organ trafficking. However, the case was later closed due to a lack of evidence. Now, we're now going to get on to the mass suicide murder that I mentioned earlier. So 2023 in Kenya, another cult, which was called the Good News International, begins preaching in Kenya. This was funded by a man named Paul Mckay. Now, followers of the cult, they were told basically they had to walk for thousands and thousands of miles without stopping until the point that they reach starvation and die. This was prove their loyalty to God, that they were putting God first. And this resulted in the deaths of 429 people in the Shakahola forest. So Kenyan officials, they begin investigating, and this led them to make connections to the Jesus Christians. In particular, Paul Mckay, he was actually influenced by Dave and Cherry. They preached that you may starve to death, which we're going to touch on in a little bit. Another figure in the JCs was a man named Jude, and his real name was Simon Smith. Now, he often went to speak on Paul Mackenzie's sermons. He wasn't nothing to do with Paul Mackenzie's cult. He was labelled as Dave Mckay's right-hand man. But he goes and speaks, and he's spreading the same messages that both Dave and Paul are spreading. And after the bodies of all these people are pulled from the Shakahola forest, a unanimous vote is taken within the Kenyan government, and it was deemed that Dave and Cherry were actually too dangerous to be allowed back into Kenya. Now, the events in the Shakahola forest was said to have been the third biggest murder/suicide in cult history, like I said, with the majority of the victims being women and children. Now, during the interview, Dave denies any links to this. He says that the politicians in Kenya, they were making up the events. They couldn't actually stop him from entering Kenya. They had no reason to stop him from entering Kenya. But one survivor of the Shakahola events told authorities that Paul Mackenzie was an avid viewer of Dave Mackay's teachings, and that Dave and Cherry even visited the area a few days after the incident. Simon Smith was also remembered for his talks about the sermon at Paul Mackenzie's. Simon would often give talks about the mark of the beast. And the mark of the beast is a doomsday prophecy in which ID cards and chips are in existence. And this was to do with the governments wanting control on their populations. Now, this is around the same time that the Kenyan government were rolling out something called the Huduma card. And Simon really wanted to protest against the Huduma card, and he was likening it to the Mark of the Beast Doomsday Prophecy. Now, Dave and Cherry, they were actually influenced by Dave and Cherry. He was 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 influenced by He said that the governments were trying to control you as they are led by the Antichrist. He's teaching you that the world's population is going to be under control, and they believed that we need money to survive, not God. He talks about, like a lot of other cults do, in particular, I've heard a lot of this bit to do with cults like the Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses. So, Jesus will soon return after the Great Tribulation. Jesus will reign after 1,000 years after this. And in some of the sermons, Paul and Simon are both heard clearly stating and asking, are you prepared to die for Jesus? Now, after the death, Simon flies to Buenos Aires in Argentina, and he eventually is tracked down. So one of the members of Dave Mckay's cult and lives on this compound flies over to do this interview with Simon. So a link is made and Simon's talking to Spotlight. And on his left is a man called Felipe. He denies that he ever went to Kenya. He said that he received an email from a congregation member asking him to give the talk, but he didn't go. He then sort of slightly backtracks. He says that anything he has ever said, it was nothing to do with people dying. He never actively asked anyone to die. But before his arrest, Paul Mckay, he had fled to a remote area in Kenya. He changes his congregation name to a church in the desert. And this was another thing that was linked to Dave because of obviously Voice in the Desert, Church of the Desert. A survivor of Shakahala Forest, her name was Salama Mesa. She managed to escape the forest with her 2 children, the youngest of which was two years old. Salama said that Paul had instructed that all mothers in the forest had to starve their children whilst they were walking, and that all husbands had to starve their wives. When asked as to why they had to fast, Paul replied, "You are fasting to go to Jesus to rest." She said that she also remembers the preacher with the white skin, and she's referring to Simon. So in the interview, the interviewer, he shows a picture of Simon Smith, and she immediately recognises him. She said that she even saw him, or someone she knew, saw Simon in the forest when the whole incident was happening in regards to the mass starvation. Again, this is something that Simon vehemently denies. The video in question regarding walking town to town until you die of starvation, this was actually deleted from Dave Mckay's website and his YouTube channel. When asked about this and the links to Paul Mackenzie's church, Dave starts laughing. So he's saying dessert. So some people say desert, some people say dessert. He's just sitting there laughing, looking pretty jovial, and to his left is Cherry and another man. He looks over at Cherry, and as soon as he looks over, she starts laughing. But it's very delayed reaction, and I think, knowing what I know about Dave Mckay, I think Cherry as well is under his full control. Dave cannot let any control off anyone. Cherry then denies that what they said was not you will starve to death. It was you may starve to death, but people shouldn't have took it so literally. Now, also questioned was at the compound in Melbourne were 4 Kenyan orphans. They were, 3 of them were adopted by Dave and Cherry's daughter, one of them by Dave and Cherry. Now, it was then questioned if the adoption had even been done legally and if it was all up to par, or were the children stolen. And Dave, at this point, he acts really angrily. He refuses to speak on the matter. He walks out. Cherry and the other man follow him. They lock all the doors in regards of the compound. So the news camera team, they follow Dave and Cherry back to the compound. And Dave locks all the doors and they're overheard discussing it. They're like, oh, it's disgusting, blah, blah. And they basically just refuse to talk anymore on that matter. Now, after the interview, the camera crew, they go away. And a little while later, about 2 or 3 days past, they go back and they find that Dave, Cherry and everyone else living in that compound had just completely vanished. They'd abandoned it and moved on to pastures new. Whilst they are in hiding, the group are still publishing videos. Their last video was actually published only a couple of weeks ago. As of yet, Paul Mckay, he is yet to be sentenced for his part in the Shakahola incident. What I do know is that he pled not guilty to anything. He's pled not guilty to influencing these people. He's pled guilty, not guilty to murder, to anything to do with it. He's bearing no responsibility whatsoever. I will update if I can find out once sentencing has passed on Paul Mckay if he is found guilty or not. And I will, of course, update if there's any more news, if anything else comes out about the Jesus Christians. That is all I've got time for you guys today. So a little bit shorter than what we've been used to for the past couple of months. But I really wanted to highlight Jesus Christians in particular with them being linked to the 3rd biggest scandal in regards of cult history. And I really just thought that it was worthy of some acknowledgement. So as always, just a huge thank you to you all. Please like and share this video. Please leave a comment if you know about this story. If you don't, leave a comment as well. I read them all and I always get back to you. Let me know if there's any cases that you want me to cover and I will have a look into them. And as always, I will see you guys real soon for the next true crime story with Silhouette. Stay safe, guys. I'll see you very soon.